Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a really complex stack of sources, the dense research, the philosophy, the clinical data, and we try to synthesize it all into the essential knowledge you actually need to be truly well-informed.
And today, we are diving into something. Well, it's a really fascinating and pretty unexpected collision point.
It really is. We're talking about the ancient metaphysics of Buddhism, this massive global trend of secular mindfulness, and the highly specialized, very sensitive science of trauma recovery.
And this is so much more than just an academic chat. It's a crucial investigation, and it has some very real-world clinical implications.
Right.
At the absolute heart of our deep dive today is the philosophical nature of the self. We're looking at the self that, ancient philosophers were trying to negate for liberation, and the self that modern clinicians are, in fact, trying to stabilize and heal.
Two very different goals.
Completely different. So our sources are really forcing us to look closely at the distinctions between the Buddhist doctrine of anātman, the whole no-self concept, the conventional reality of the Pudgala, or the person, and then the functional self, as we understand it from modern cognitive science.
So our mission today, it's really laser-focused, and it's based on this critical warning we found running through the material. We are going to explore why a superficial, kind of uncritical adoption of this no-self idea in therapy.
Which happens all the time.
All the time. Why that move, which is so often driven by this westernized idea of Buddhism as just a neutral, secular science of the mind, can actually lead to significant psychological harm.
Harm that has a name, spiritual bypassing.
Exactly. Spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
And if we can achieve one thing for you today, it's to really resolve a critical tension here.
Yes. We have to meticulously, carefully distinguish between the illusory, substantial, permanent self, that's the metaphysical target the Buddha was focused on, and the functional, constructed, temporary person.
And that second one, the person, that's the key.
That is the key. Because that second category, the person, it's the set of structures that is necessary for any of us to coherently experience reality, to have relationships, hold memories, and most importantly, possess the stability that you absolutely need for healing to even begin.
So if you are engaging with mindfulness, if you're in contemplative practice, or you're involved in trauma-informed care in any way, this deep dive, it's essential. We need to get a handle on the philosophical baggage we inherit when we adopt these practices, and what happens when we try to transcend a self that isn't really fully formed or repaired yet.
That's a perfect way to put it.
All right, let's start with the context, because it's overwhelming. Mindfulness has gone completely global. Our sources point out this astonishingly rapid and, as you said, often largely uncritical growth of these practices.
Oh, it's everywhere. It's no longer confined to, retreat centers or some niche clinical trials. It's a massive cultural product.
And a commercial one.
A huge commercial one. You see it being used in everything from venture capitalism, where it's sold as a tool to maximize your focus and productivity.
The ultimate cognitive enhancement.
Right, to stress reduction programs in Fortune 500 companies. It's even being promoted in these niche self-seeking activities that are aimed at enhancing specific life experiences, often completely divorced from its ethical or metaphysical roots.
So it's become a profit center.
A massive one. And that rapid commercialization is what's really fueled its uncritical, widespread adoption. It's a tool now.
And this leads us directly to something the scholars are calling Buddhist exceptionalism. I find this fascinating. Why is Buddhism seen as so different from other spiritual traditions when it comes to secularization?
Well, this is a whole discourse that suggests Buddhism is somehow unique, that it's inherently rational, and because of that, it's readily secularized. The argument basically goes that you can just strip away all the, mythological, ritualistic, or metaphysical stuff.
The religion part.
The religion part, exactly. And what you're left with is a sophisticated, pre-packaged, rational science of the mind that's just uniquely compatible with modern scientific inquiry.
It's ready-made for the lab.
Perfectly. And this framing allows Western culture to adopt the techniques wholesale and very profitably without ever having to grapple with the really complex and sometimes challenging philosophy underneath.
So the idea is just forget reincarnation, forget the gods, forget the whole cosmology. Just give me the meditation technique that's going to make my brain work better and lower my stress.
Precisely. And it's that intellectual maneuver, that neat little trick, that creates the context for adopting these core Buddhist principles, like anātman, into clinical settings without nearly enough philosophical groundwork.
So let's do that groundwork. Let's delve into what anātman actually means, the doctrine of no self.
At its simplest, it states that the self, as we experience it, is understood to be illusory.
Illusory in what sense, though? I mean, I feel like a self right now.
Of course. And that's the point. The feeling is real, but the doctrine says that if you perform a really rigorous investigation into your own inner makeup, if you really look, you will not find any independent, abiding entity that qualifies as an inner subject or a fixed agent behind all your thoughts and actions.
So the feeling of being a stable, independent me exists.
Yes.
But when you look for the thing that corresponds to that feeling, it's not there.
It doesn't map to any real independent entity. It's a profound cognitive delusion. The tradition often calls it self-grasping.
And crucially, the sources really emphasize that this doctrine isn't just. It's not just descriptive. It's not just an observation.
Not at all. It's not like saying the sky is blue. The doctrine of anātman is fundamentally soteriological and normative.
Okay, unpack those terms for us.
Soteriological means it relates to salvation or liberation. The ultimate goal here is freedom from suffering, dukkha, and the path to that freedom requires abandoning the belief in an independent, abiding self.
Because that belief is the problem.
That belief is seen as the root cause of all suffering. And it's normative because it prescribes the correct way to view reality. It's saying, this problematic illusion must be undone for you to be free.
But then you have the popular modern assertion, the so-called neuro-Buddhist assertion, which tries to validate this ancient soteriological goal using contemporary science, right?
Exactly. This is the modern move. Thinkers argue that cognitive science actually corroborates the truth of no self. The brain, according to this view, simply generates the illusion of self.
And they'll often view this through an evolutionary lens.
Yes, the idea is that operating under this delusion of a separate self provides some kind of evolutionary fitness for agency, for social interaction, but it's metaphysically untrue. It's a useful fiction that evolution gave us.
So the argument essentially goes, the Buddha discovered this truth subjectively through meditation thousands of years ago, and now the fMRI scanner is confirming it objectively.
That's the modern synthesis in a nutshell. And to really understand the basis of that original claim, we have to go back to the method the Buddha used to deny the self, which was by appealing to the 5 aggregates, the skandhas.
Okay, let's unpack the skandhas. This is the core empirical framework he used.
So the Anatta Sutta details this denial pretty clearly. The Buddha argued that when we analyze any given being, any person, we can only find 5 components. These are the skandhas. You have the body or form.
Vesical matter.
Right. Then feeling, pleasure, pain, neutrality, then perception, the recognition of things, then volition, which is all your mental formations, intentions, habits, and finally consciousness, just raw awareness.
And his argument was that none of these 5 are fit to be regarded as a permanent self.
Exactly. Because if any of them were a self, they'd have to be permanent, controllable, and unchanging, but they're not.
They're all demonstrably impermanent.
Completely. Take feeling, for example. You might be feeling pleasure right now, but in an hour you could feel stress or boredom or sadness. That feeling is transitory. It comes and goes. If that feeling was yourself, then yourself would be constantly disappearing and reappearing, which makes it, uncontrollable.
You can't just decide to be happy forever.
You can't. And since all 5 of these aggregates are subject to decay, to change, to suffering, the Buddha concluded that you cannot find a stable personal essence within any of these changing states. They are anat, not self. This empirical reductionist denial is really the foundation of the whole doctrine.
And it sounds like a philosophical slam dunk. But as we're about to see, reducing the person to just a collection of impermanent parts, well, it ran into some very serious problems, both historically and scientifically.
It did. The Buddhist position is powerful, no doubt. The person is a mere collection of parts, and the self is an illusion driven by grasping. But this view was immediately contested, starting right there in ancient India itself.
And we have to acknowledge the context here, the historical coevolution of this idea. The Buddhist anātman doctrine didn't just appear in a vacuum. It was a direct response to the classical Brahminical concept of Atman.
The debate was incredibly rich. It spanned centuries. And what's really interesting is that many of those Brahminical philosophers, they actually agreed with the Buddhist analysis of the skandhas.
Really? They agreed the aggregates were not self?
Yes, many of them did. They concurred that the 5 aggregates, body, feeling, perception, all of it, are not self. They agreed these components are impermanent, they're subject to change, they're not the real you.
So they weren't fighting over whether your body or your feelings were permanent?
Not at all. Their contention was that the true Atman, the ultimate eternal self, transcended the aggregates entirely. They often identified this true self as pure, eternal, unchanging consciousness, something that resided beyond all those transient components.
So the Buddhist argument, while sound on its own terms, didn't necessarily disprove their idea of a self outside the aggregates.
Exactly. And this context is so crucial because it clarifies the target. Buddhism was specifically targeting the substantialist and essentialist self, the idea of a permanent, unchanging core being.
Okay, so let's fast forward. If we drop the idea of a transcendent self for a moment, and we stick with that reductionist view, the self is just a conventional name for a collection of impersonal events, we run into this massive counter-argument from modern cognitive science.
You do.
How do we account for the stunning subjective unity of our experience?
This is the critical philosophical and scientific juncture. Cognitive science finds itself unable to simply dismiss the self as an illusion. Instead, it suggests the self has to be a necessary construction.
A construction, not an illusion. What's the difference?
Well, if the self were purely illusory, we face what's called the explanatory gap. If everything is just a chain of impersonal, causally related events, A causes B, B causes C, then why do I experience a unified memory? Why do I have seamless perceptual recognition? Why does my action feel integrated and agentive?
It feels like that unified experience needs something more than just a label, a convention.
It requires a functional structure that is actively doing organizing work. And what's just fascinating is that this isn't some uniquely modern Western problem. Our sources highlight that classical Indian philosophers anticipated this exact issue. Specifically, the Nayakas from the Nyaya school of Hindu philosophy.
And they were rigorous logicians.
Incredibly rigorous. And they identified two problems that sound strikingly contemporary: the binding problem and the problem of the unity of consciousness.
Okay, let's take those one at a time. The binding problem.
The binding problem is phenomenal. When you look at an object, let's say you're looking at a yellow banana, your brain is processing the color yellow in one region, the curvature in another, the location in a third. If the self is just a bunch of impersonal processes, why don't you experience those qualities separately? Why do you see one single coherent object, a yellow banana?
The qualities have to be bound together.
They have to be bound together for you to perceive a coherent object, and the mind performs that binding.
Okay, so what about the unity of consciousness problem?
That's even more profound. It states that all these distinct bound perceptions, seeing the banana, hearing the refrigerator hum in the background, feeling the chair under you, all of these must be unified and belonging to a single unified subject.
Without that subject.
Without that subject, you wouldn't know that the sight of the banana and the feeling of the chair belong to the same psychological stream. They could just be random data points floating in space. There'd be no you for them to happen to.
Which means that if the self were truly just a conventional designation like calling an assembly of wheels and wood a chariot, it just wouldn't be able to account for the actual causal work of unifying all our experience.
Precisely. To experience an external world at all, unity and coherence have to be imparted to that experience. Now, this doesn't force us back to the idea of an eternal substantive self, the Atman, but it absolutely requires us to postulate a functional self that goes way beyond a merely conventional designation.
This takes us into the realm of Western philosophy, with thinkers like Galen Strawson, who argues for the reality of these immediate episodic selves.
Strawson offers a really powerful naturalist counterpoint to the total illusion idea. He argues that the self is rooted in our immediate phenomenological experience. It's constituted by consciousness in the here and now. He calls it an episodic self.
So it's not permanent, but it's real in the moment.
It's concretely, experientially real in the moment of its existence. It's the lived reality of being a subject of experience. And that lived reality, that episodic self, is what requires stabilization, not immediate negation, especially when we're talking about a clinical context.
Absolutely. The moment-to-moment reality of that self, even if it's transitory, that's the only place we have to begin.
It is. So the key insight here is this. The self, constructed in the unity of perception, the one that solves the binding and unity problems, is demonstrably required for the world of objects to even be experienceable by a subject.
So to sort of sum up this really complex philosophical back and forth, the self is a construction. It's a process. It's a socially embedded subject of experience. It's required for us to function.
Correct. The illusion is the belief that this construction is stable, unchanging, and possesses some kind of permanent essence. But the construction itself, the unified, coherent subject, It does real causal work. And this constructive functional self is exactly what the Buddhist tradition refers to as the Pudgala.
Okay, so we've established this huge difference between the ultimate negated self, the anātman, and the functional constructed self that we need for experience. Now let's fully introduce the concept that bridges this gap in classical Buddhist thought, the conventional reality of Pudgala.
The Pudgala is the necessary companion concept here. The Buddha, while he was denying the ultimate self, he clearly allowed for a sense of persons. Pudgala is the conventional designation, a useful shorthand in speech for that assemblage of parts or aggregates we just talked about.
It's conventionally real.
It is conventionally real. And this is where the famous chariot analogy comes from.
Right, from the Vajra Sutta.
Yes. Just as with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used, so when the aggregates exist, there is the convention, a being. And the Vajra Sutta reinforces this, calling the Pudgala the bearer of the burden of the 5 aggregates.
So it's the person who experiences life, the person who carries karma, the one who seeks liberation.
Exactly. But, and this is a huge but, if the reductionist view just stops there, if it just says the Pudgala is only a conventional label, nothing more than a chariot, that's where the philosophical problem comes roaring back.
Why? Why does that analogy fail?
It fails fundamentally because the analogy is deeply flawed. A chariot is an inanimate assembly of parts. If you take the wheels and the axle and the frame away, nothing is left. A person, the Pudgala, is a sentient being.
It has an inner life.
It has an inner life. It has memory, subjective experience, intentionality, moral agency. These qualities, sentience and subjective coherence, they can't be fully accounted for by just slapping a label on an assemblage of parts. The reductionist view, when you take it to its extreme, it fails to explain the qualitative difference between a complex machine and a living, suffering being.
So the Pudgala has to be more than just a convenient label. It has to be a structure of experience.
It absolutely must. This construct possesses real explanatory power that goes beyond being merely designatory. Because the Pudgala organizes and unifies experience, it's necessary to explain emergent behavior complex actions, like, I don't know, deciding to help a stranger or maintaining a coherent long-term goal.
So it explains what philosophy calls downward causal action.
Exactly. From higher levels within the system, like the mind influencing the body, or complex cognitive structures influencing simple behaviors.
Let me just make sure I'm getting the key insight here for you, the listener. These self-structures, the Pudgala, they are real because they do real causal work. They aren't substantial in the sense of being eternal, but they're causative in the world of our experience.
That is the nugget. That is it. And that's why they are so crucial for trauma-informed practice. You cannot heal an experience or an agent if you deny the very structure that does the causal work of experiencing or acting in the first place.
And to illustrate this, we can actually use categories of selfhood that have been mapped out by cognitive scientists, which fit perfectly inside this framework of the Pudgala.
They do. Ulrich Neisser's classic categories are a great way to break this down.
Okay, so let's walk through some of them. Let's detail exactly what kind of structure we're talking about.
We can start with the most basic one, the ecological self. This is our bodily self-awareness. It's the experience of being situated in the environment, knowing where your body begins and ends, being dynamically attuned to your surroundings.
It's how you walk through a door without bumping into the frame.
It is, and this structure performs the real causal work of physical safety and navigation. Then you have the interpersonal self.
The Pudgala in relation to others.
Exactly. It's intersubjective self-awareness. It's the framework that allows you to read social cues, to empathize, to form attachments. This structure performs the causal work of social bonding and emotional regulation, and it's established through all our early relationships.
The third is the extended or temporal self. And this seems absolutely vital for our discussion on trauma.
It's fundamental. This is the narrative, the capacity to construct a coherent life story. It is the ability to connect the me who existed yesterday to the me who is anticipating a tomorrow. This structure performs the causal work of temporality, of memory organization and planning. Without it, you're just adrift in time.
And what about the private self?
This refers to our inner experience, our subjectivity, our pre-reflexive awareness, that silent, unarticulated awareness of I'm experiencing. It's the qualitative felt sense of just being present. This structure performs the causal work of pure subjectivity and internal monitoring.
And finally, the conceptual self.
This is the highest level, the mental representation of yourself, reflective self-awareness. It's the structure that allows you to say things like, I am a student, or I am kind, or I am a good worker. This structure performs the causal work of identity and reflective thought.
So these 5 categories, ecological, interpersonal, temporal, private, conceptual, these are the organizational structures that enable our memory, our agency, our relationships. And it's precisely these systems, this functional pudgala, that are so ruthlessly disrupted by trauma.
And the beauty of this is that interpersonal neurobiological research from experts like Alan Shore, Dan Siegel, Peter Fonagy, it substantiates the causative nature of these structures without needing to believe in a substantialist self. They show that our early relationships literally form these selfhood structures.
So if that formation is faulty because of neglect or abuse,
then the structures themselves are damaged, which demonstrates their causal reality. For example, Porges's polyvagal theory explains how a trauma-shaped schema of the relational self gets encoded physiologically, right in the nervous system.
so the body is constantly assessing for threat.
Constantly. And if it's chronically dysregulated because of past trauma, that physiological response perpetuates an inaccurate schema, leading the person to perceive their environment and their relationships as hostile, even when they're objectively safe.
That is proof of causal functionality right there.
It is. The body's response structure, part of the embodied pudgala, is doing the real work of influencing perception and behavior. If these structures are damaged, they require repair, reintegration, and stabilization. They cannot be simply transcended or dissolved away.
Okay, now we make the essential connection. If the pudgala is this necessary functional structure for coherence, then trauma is defined as the event or the response to an event that fundamentally disorders and threatens these structures of selfhood. It's an attack on identity and subjectivity.
And this holds true whether we're talking about acute, single-incident violence or chronic developmental trauma. Chronic trauma, whether it's a trauma of commission, like abuse, or trauma of omission, like profound neglect, it prevents the healthy development of a cohesive pudgala structure in the first place.
The absence of a soothing and restorative experience.
It fundamentally disrupts the child's developing sense of personhood. The structure is malformed from the ground up.
And since trauma happens at this subjective, personal level, the repair must also happen at the personal level. Our sources outline several critical domains that get disordered by trauma, and they detail exactly why the person must be therapeutically addressed.
Yes, let's delve into 5 key ways that trauma shatters the pudgala.
Okay. First, trauma in temporality, which ruptures the extended or narrative self.
This is perhaps the most profound rupture of all. Trauma is so often defined by its detemporalized quality. The foundational work in this area described it as an event that becomes locked into a recursive, repetitive pattern. The traumatic event just cannot be assigned to the past.
It's not history.
It's not history. Human beings live, as Heidegger explored, by comporting themselves into a future organized by a past. But if the trauma can't be filed away as history, what happens to the person?
The narrative self is ruptured.
It's fundamentally ruptured. The traumatic experience remains sensate and effective, continually invading the present moment. This prevents the person from moving toward any kind of future, because the past is always right now. The horizon of trauma never collapses into history.
Oh, healing must be about retemporalization.
Exactly. It requires intensive retemporalization through gradual, gentle exposure and processing, so the traumatic event can finally be owned as history rather than being perpetually relived. The structure of the extended self has to be rebuilt piece by painstaking piece.
Second, trauma in defense, which affects the agentual and temporal self.
Right. The entire defensive structure of our psyche, things like repression, dissociation, it's an attempt to protect the fragile structures of the pudgala, or the ego in psychoanalytic terms, from just overwhelming material. When the danger is too great, the psyche tries to wall off that painful content. The defense process is an active, ongoing attempt to maintain structural integrity.
But when those defenses fail?
When they fail, the trauma material just rushes in. And not as a memory, but as a current lived experience, the individual becomes possessed by the traumatic experience, flashbacks, overwhelming emotion, rather than possessing it as their personal history.
The self is overwhelmed.
It's utterly overwhelmed, losing its capacity for agency and stability. So trying to dissolve the self through meditation in that state, that's not liberation. It's just another form of defense failure or dissociation.
Third, trauma and relationality, which disorders the interpersonal self.
And this disorder is just devastating. Because the past continually invades the present and the nervous system is locked into a pattern of threat assessment, trauma generates this effective rupture that makes secure, intimate relationships feel unbearable or even impossible.
So the trauma sufferer develops rigid psychological defense structures.
And fixed relational models, often based on early relational failures. They expect abandonment or they expect violence. Their whole interpersonal world is colored by that.
And what are the clinical manifestations of this relational brittleness?
You see these characteristic polarized responses, either a profound affective blandness, a kind of numbness, a deep inability to feel or express emotion, which protects the self from the risk of connection, or, on the other extreme, overreactive, unregulated affect, where small triggers lead to huge emotional explosions.
And both of those extremes shut down real connection.
They effectively shut down genuine intersubjective connection, isolating the person and proving that the functional relational structure is deeply, deeply damaged.
Fourth, trauma and memory, which impacts the embodied and affective self.
Trauma creates a fragmented memory system. We often see a double memory split, especially in dissociative conditions. The person maintains a functional, current self, the adult who goes to work, while simultaneously harboring this secret, victimized past self that they still feel they fundamentally are.
They're split between their history and their present.
Exactly. And neurobiologically, this split is supported by evidence. Research suggests that memory retrieval pathways can be actively blocked for life-threatening events.
Which is why trauma survivors often struggle to verbalize or cognitively process the event.
Yes. The capacity of cognition to connect with the affect and the sensation of the trauma is radically reduced. And this results in a loss of reflective function, the ability to put words to feelings and connect those feelings to bodily sensations and cognitions. The embodied and affective self-structures are malformed and disconnected from each other.
And finally, fifth, trauma and resource, which obliterates the agential self.
At its absolute core, trauma is a crisis that manifests a crushing lack of resources to deal with experience, either past or present. The individual is fundamentally rendered powerless. They were often powerless during the original events, and now they feel powerless to prevent the resurgence of the memories or the symptoms.
The subjective feeling is just, I can't.
I can't, exactly. This loss of capacity fundamentally disrupts the agential facet of selfhood, the structure responsible for initiating action and feeling like a sovereign being in the world. And this is why resource establishment is the absolute foundation for recovery. You cannot ask a person who feels powerless in their own body and history to go and explore transpersonal realms. They must first regain the fundamental resource to simply operate as a person in the world.
This detailed analysis of the damaged functional pudgala brings us directly to the inherent danger of this uncritical adoption of the no-self doctrine, spiritual bypassing. If the self is broken, telling someone to dissolve it it's just deeply risky.
The term was coined by John Welwood decades ago, and it's perfect. It perfectly describes using sophisticated spiritual language or practices like intense meditation aimed at non-duality or emptiness to sidestep or avoid confronting unresolved psychological wounds, unfinished developmental tasks, or deeply repressed emotional content.
So when the pudgala is broken by trauma, dismissing the self isn't an act of transcendent liberation.
It is merely another sophisticated form of avoidance or dissociation. That's all it is.
And to really understand this mechanism, we need to bring in Ken Wilber's structural model and his concept of the pre-trance fallacy. This gives us the necessary map for understanding why people confuse wounded states with enlightened ones.
Wilber's model is so useful here. It organizes experience into these broad developmental stages. We move from the pre-personal. That covers the developmental stages before a cohesive separate self or pudgala is even formed. And it can also include regressive or psychotic states if that developmental stage is arrested. From there, you move through the personal stage, which is the healthy, functional, structured self, the integrated pudgala.
And then finally,
we can move to the transpersonal, which describes mystical or contemplative states that genuinely transcend the normal egoic framework.
And the fallacy then is the dangerous confusion between that first stage and the third.
The pre-trance fallacy is confusing non-rational pre-personal states, which are regressive, wounded, and developmentally immature, with genuine transrational states, which are mystical and post-egoic. A severely traumatized person, someone who is developmentally arrested in areas of relationality or temporality, is struggling with pre-personal wounds.
Can you give us an example of how this might play out in practice?
Sure. A trauma survivor might experience profound emotional numbness or dissociation. That's a defense mechanism rooted in a pre-personal wound. A secular mindfulness teacher, well-meaning but ill-informed, might interpret this numbness as the enlightened state of non-attachment or the abandonment of self-grasping.
Oh, wow.
So the person is effectively being told that their psychological defense mechanism is spiritual achievement. Instead of healing the wound, they bypass it by confusing dissociation with detachment. They mistake a symptom of their trauma for transpersonal liberation.
And this seems to be something that was explicitly prevented in traditional Buddhist paths through the necessity of these preliminary practices.
Absolutely. In traditions like Tibetan Buddhism, preliminary practices, the Ngöndro, are required precisely because the tradition recognizes that the mind must be prepared and stabilized before you go diving into deeper, often destabilizing explorations of transpersonal realms like emptiness.
So these practices are designed to, build the person up?
In essence, yes. They're designed to integrate ethics, gather mental energy, and purify obscurations. Fundamentally, they build the functional Pudgala. They make you a stable, ethical, integrated person.
Which aligns perfectly with Western developmental psychology, Piaget, Lovinger, Cook-Rader. They all show a pattern where the functional integrated personal stage is a prerequisite for moving into any kind of post-personal or transpersonal understanding.
The structure must be built and stabilized before it can be effectively and safely dissolved. And this leads us to the central argument from our sources, one that provides a really clear ethical path forward.
Which is?
In a Western context where so many people are struggling with developmental trauma, psychological practice, which focuses explicitly on healing and stabilizing the causative structures of the Pudgala, constitutes the necessary preliminary practice before one can safely engage in meditative exploration of these deeper transpersonal domains.
So what are the clinical risks if we skip that preliminary work? What happens?
The clinical danger is significant, and it's well documented. Without attending to the disordering effects of trauma on the selfhood structures, an unintegrated mindfulness practice risks re-traumatization. Forcing the dissolution of the self through intense practice when the self structures are already fragmented can easily exacerbate dissociative conditions.
And in vulnerable individuals?
It can even precipitate psychotic episodes where the reality structure itself just destabilizes. When you lack a stable sense of a temporal, agential self, striving for the ultimate absence of self can lead to a catastrophic loss of ground. It is an absolute imperative to intervene at the level of the causative frameworks underpinning personal identity first.
Okay, so we've established that this distinction between the ultimate absence of self, anātman, and the conventional functional person, the Pudgala, is critical for safety and for healing. To fully anchor this sophisticated understanding, we have to return to the broader philosophical mechanism that holds this tension together in Buddhism, the Two Truths doctrine.
Yes, the Dvasatya. The two truths, conventional reality and ultimate reality, provide the crucial philosophical antidote to spiritual bypassing. If the structures of selfhood, the Pudgala, are understood as part of conventional reality, then they are functional and real within that domain.
They can't just be dismissed.
They cannot be simply dismissed as unreal in the search for ultimate liberation. Conventional truth possesses a sense of reality that is necessary for navigating and functioning effectively in the world.
So a stable self is conventionally real, even if it's ultimately empty of essence. A chair is conventionally real. A relationship is conventionally real. These are necessary facts of our shared experience.
Exactly. The ultimate truth is the realm of anātman, the absence of intrinsic existence. But if you deny the reality of the person, the Pudgala, in the conventional domain, you collapse the entire framework. You create this deep, practical, and philosophical incoherence. The functional self must be respected as the agent through which all conventional sufferings experienced and ultimately overcome.
And this concept of ultimate truth is, of course, intimately tied to the Mahayana concept of emptiness, or shunyata. And just like anātman, shunyata is subject to profound and dangerous misunderstanding in its rapid Western uptake.
It really is. Shunyata means emptiness, groundlessness, or voidness. In the Mahayana tradition, it's meticulously defined as meaning that all things are empty of intrinsic existence, or svabhava.
Which means they lack independent self-nature.
Yes, they exist only interdependently. This is a subtle and profound philosophical realization about interconnectedness. It's not about nothingness.
But what happens when a vulnerable person who's seeking quick liberation from their suffering misunderstands that idea of groundlessness?
If shunyata is misinterpreted as simple nothingness or annihilation, it can lead directly to a nihilistic dismissal not just of the essentialist self, but of the world entire, meaning knowledge, ethical agency, they all lose their foundations.
And for someone already struggling with severe trauma and a shattered pudgala,
Interpreting ultimate reality as a nihilistic void poses clear, immediate clinical dangers. It offers no basis for moving forward, only a justification for collapse and despair.
it really sounds then as though the Buddhist tradition already contained all the necessary guardrails, the distinction between anātman and pudgala, the two truths doctrine, to prevent this kind of destructive bypass. But those mechanisms were overlooked or stripped out when mindfulness was rushed into these secular, marketable frameworks.
That is the essential conclusion from the sources. The subtler understanding that the self must be functional and stable, the pudgala, before the attempt is made to realize its ultimate absence of essence, the anātman, is critical. Therapeutic work must address the selfhood structures first, because the self, as a structure of experience, is more than illusory. It is a causative framework that is absolutely essential for psychological functioning.
So we started this deep dive, exploring the surprising and really high-stakes consequences of mixing ancient doctrine, modern therapy, and a lot of uncritical enthusiasm. We've thoroughly mapped the philosophical landscape, and I think we've revealed a truth that's essential for any informed practitioner or just a curious learner. Being truly well-informed about mindfulness means recognizing its deep metaphysical baggage and the absolute necessity of psychological personal stability, the healing of the pudgala, before you seek genuine transpersonal realization.
And the key takeaway nugget is this. Contemporary cognitive science finds congruence with classical Buddhist doctrine only when the substantialist, eternal self is distinguished from the self as a functional, causative structure of experience, the pudgala. The person is a construction, not a fixed entity, and that construction must be stabilized and integrated before it can be safely explored and potentially, ultimately, transcended.
It shifts the therapeutic imperative.
Completely. From instant dissolution to foundational building.
And that building process is about taking responsibility for the functional agent that is you.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the functional self, the pudgala, is a necessary constructed structure without which you would be incapable of experiencing anything coherently, what shifts in your daily life or in your contemplative practice when you start treating your sense of self as a causative function, as something you must actively build and maintain, rather than a fixed substance?
That's a huge shift.
It is. What new ethical and emotional responsibilities arise from understanding your person as the necessary agent for processing your own history? And maybe most importantly, what kind of structure are you actively building today?